inside the lower realm. Gentlemen, at the sound of the man's voice, I opened my eyes. He stood before the bench addressing us. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave," he said. "This is a private park." I stared at him. A private park in Summerland? I began to speak, but Albert cut me off. "Of course," he said. "We didn't realize." "That's quite all right," the man replied. He was middle-aged, distinguished looking, dressed with care. "If you'll leave immediately," he told us, "no more need be said." "Right away," Albert agreed, rising from the bench. I looked at him, not understanding. It seemed unlike him to allow this man to exclude us from a park in Summerland without a word of reaction. I stood and began to speak again, but Albert took my arm and whispered, "Never mind." The man observed us with polite remoteness as we started towards the gateway. "What is this?" I asked. It wouldn't help to challenge him, Albert told me. He wouldn't understand. These people here are in a strange condition. In life, they never did actual harm to anyone, and are causing no harm here. Hence the relative graciousness of their surroundings. On the other hand, there's no way to pierce their shell of affectation. They live a limited existence, which they, nonetheless, believe to be completely appropriate to their class. They think they're in a smart location, you see, a spot restricted to those of their social standing. They have no conception of the fact that in Summerland, there are no sets or cliques. They're living a delusion of group superiority, which words cannot affect. I shook my head as we left the park. "Grotesque," I said. "It's nothing compared to what you face if we continue on." We walked in silence for a while. Somehow I sensed that we were not continuing towards the edge of Summerland, but circling where we were, Albert giving me time to make up my mind. At last I did. "Since the risk is mine, not Anne's," I said, "I want to continue. She can only be helped. Except," he reminded me, "in the sense that if you become imprisoned in the etheric world, your reunion could be delayed." He stopped, and I knew he'd been about to tell me how long our reunion might be delayed. 100 years, 1,000. Fear took hold of me again. Was I foolish to attempt this? Wasn't 24 years preferable to... The decision came at that. The thought of Anne alone, and God only knew what dreadful place, for nearly a quarter of a century. I couldn't let that happen without trying to help. I wouldn't. "All right," Albert said, knowing my decision as I made it. "We'll go on then, and I admire your devotion, Chris. You may not realize it yet, but what you're about to do is very courageous." I didn't reply, but as we walked on, realized that subtly we had altered our direction and were once more moving towards the edge of Summerland. Ahead, I saw a small church. Like the park, it was not unattractive, yet lacked that perfection which marked everything I'd seen before in Summerland. Its color was dingy brown, its brickwork chipped and faded. As we drew closer to it, I began to hear a congregation singing. "Weary of earth and laden with my sins, I gaze at heaven and long to enter in." I looked at Albert, startled. "But they're here," I said. "They don't know it," he replied. "So they spend their time singing dreary hymns and listening to dreary sermons." I felt a sense of anxiety pervading me again. If it could be like this in Summerland itself, what would it be like when we'd left this realm entirely? Albert stopped. We faced a stretch of flinty ground with patches of grass that looked dry and wasted. "We'd better change our clothing now," he said. "Wear shoes." I was about to ask him why, then knew he wouldn't have suggested it if it weren't a necessity. I concentrated on the change. The fluttering sensation on the surface of my skin seemed slower here, as though it labored. I looked down, seeing, with a start, that once more I was wearing the outfit I'd had on the night of the accident. I turned my gaze to Albert. He was wearing a blue shirt and trousers, a beige jacket. The clothes I was wearing when they took me to the hospital, he said. I felt myself grimace as he spoke. Is it going to be like this from now on? I asked. The air felt liquid and granular in my throat. We'll have to start adjusting to the changes in environment, he told me. Visualize yourself as you'd have to exist here without discomfort. I tried, and gradually began to have the impression of feeling myself thicken. The feeling was subtle but distinct. The texture of my flesh took on a certain density, and now the air was breathable. How different to my lungs, though, no longer crystal clear and invigorating. This air was heavy. It supported my existence, nothing more. I looked around the countryside as we walked on, if countryside is the word for what I saw. No fruitful landscape here, only barren ground, dying grass, stunted, virtually defoliated trees, no sign of water, and no houses, which came as little surprise. Who would willingly reside here was my thought. You'll see those who willingly reside in places which are so appalling that by comparison, this is a place of beauty, Albert said. I tried not to shudder. Are you trying to dissuade me? I asked. Prepare you, he said. Even so, no matter what I say, you cannot possibly envision what you may be forced to see. Again, I was about to question him, again decided not to do it. He knew. I didn't. I had better not waste energy contesting anything he told me. I needed my resources for whatever lay ahead. What lay immediately ahead was a desolate, prairie-like expanse. As we walked across it, the turf grew less and less resilient, and I noted the beginnings of jagged cracks in the ground. There were no breezes now. The air lay still and waited, getting cooler as we progressed. Or was it retrogressed? Am I imagining the light fading again? I asked. No, he answered quietly. His tone of voice seemed to me to be declining with the look of the terrain, growing more withdrawn as moments passed. Except it isn't fading to help you rest. It's fading because we're almost to the lower realm, which is also called the darker realm. There was a man ahead. He stood impassive, watching our approach. I thought that he was someone who, for some unknown reason, chose to live here. I was wrong. This is where the lower realms begin, he told us. It's no place for the curious. I'm here to help someone, I said. The man looked at Albert, who nodded and said, That's right. You aren't entering just to look, the man said warningly. No, Albert told him. We're searching for this man's wife to try to help her. The man nodded and put his hand on our shoulders. Go with God, then, and be alert at all times. Be aware. Albert nodded again, and the man removed his hand from our shoulders. The very second we crossed the border, I was uncomfortable, oppressed, filled with an almost overwhelming desire to turn and flee back to that safer place. I had to will myself from retreating. Tell me if you want to go back, Albert said. Had he gotten my thought, or was it obvious what I'd been thinking at the moment? All right, I said. No matter when you feel it, he added. I knew then that he couldn't reach my mind anymore. We have to speak aloud now, don't we? I said. Yes, he answered. It was disconcerting to see his lips move again. Somehow that slight move did more to convince me that we were in the lower realm than anything I felt or saw. What did I see? Almost nothing. We walked through a colorless vista. the dull sky blending with the ground until it seemed as though we trudged across a gray continuum. Is there no scenery here at all? I asked. Nothing permanent, he said. Whatever you may see, a tree, a bush, a rock, will only be a thought form created by some person on this level. The overall appearance represents the composite mental image of its inhabitants. This is their composite mental image? I asked. Soundless, hueless, lifeless? It is, he said. And you work here? I felt stunned that anyone who had the choice would elect to work in this forbidding place. This is nothing, was all he said. I was not mistaken in my observation. His voice was less than it had been in Summerland. Clearly, the inertness of this place affected even speech. What did I sound like, I wondered. It's getting cold, I noticed then. Conceive of warmth around you, Albert said. I tried, discovering that gradually the cold became less harsh. Is it better? Albert asked. I said it was. Remember, though, he told me, as we travel further, it will require more and more adaptive concentration on your part, just to adjust to the effects of the environment. A concentration which will grow harder and harder for you to command. I looked around, a new uneasiness beginning. It's getting dark now, I said. Conceive of light around you, Albert told me. Conceive of light? I thought. I tried, although I couldn't understand how it could help. It did, however. Bit by bit, the shadows gathering around us starting to lighten. How does it work? I asked. Light here is obtained exclusively by the action of thought on the atmosphere, he told us. Let there be light is more than just a phrase. Those who come to this realm in an unprogressed state are quite literally in the dark. Their minds not advanced enough to produce the light which would enable them to see. Is that why they can't go higher? I asked, thinking uneasily of Anne. Because they actually can't see to find their way? That can be part of it, he said. However, even if they could see with their eyes, their systems would be unable to survive in a higher realm. The air, for instance, would be so rarefied to them that breathing would be painful, if not impossible. I looked around the bleak, unending countryside. This could be called Winterland, I said, the sight depressing me. It could, he agreed, except that memories of winter on Earth are often pleasant ones. Nothing here is pleasant. Does your work here succeed? I asked. He sighed, and glancing at him in the nocturnal light, I saw that his expression was one of melancholy. A look I'd never seen on his face before. You know, from personal experience, how difficult it is to make people on Earth believe in afterlife, he said. It is far more difficult here. The reception I've usually gotten is that of a naive church worker in the most vile of ghettos. My words greeted with scornful laughter, coarse jokes, verbal abuse of every kind. It isn't hard to understand why so many dwellers in this realm have been here for ages. I looked at him with such dismay that he looked surprised, then, realizing what he'd said, suddenly repentant. Even he had lost perception here. I'm sorry, Chris, he said. I didn't mean that Anne would be here that long. I've told you how long. He sighed again. You see, what I meant about the atmosphere of this place affecting one's thinking, despite what I believe, I've already let it work on my convictions. The larger truth, of course, is that every soul will eventually rise. I've never heard of any spirit being permanently abandoned, no matter how evil. And your Anne is far from evil. All I intended to say is that there are misguided souls who have been in this realm for what amounts, to them at any rate, to an eternity. He said no more, and I did not pursue it. I didn't want to think of Anne being held here endlessly, or of myself a prisoner inside the lower realm. Entry to Dark Thoughts. There was an odor in the air, a smell which I can only describe as one of corruption. Ahead lay what appeared to be a sprawling collection of hovels. I'd say a village, but there seemed no arrangement to the shacks and huts. What is this place? I asked. A gathering place for those of similar nature, Albert said. She isn't, I began to ask, then couldn't finish. The idea was too dismaying to voice. I don't think so, Albert answered. I was going to say thank God when it occurred to me that where Anne was might be worse than this. I tried to resist the thought, but was unable to dislodge it. I knew it was unjust to her, but couldn't help it. The baleful influence of the realm was affecting my mind. There was no sound ahead as we approached the haphazard jumble of shanties. All I could hear was the scuffling of our shoes on the gray, flinty soil. Off to our right, I saw some people moving aimlessly, others standing motionless, all dressed in shabby clothes. Who were they, I wondered? What had they done or failed to do that they should be here? We walked within a few yards of a group of them, several men and women. Even though Albert had said he didn't think that Anne was here, I found myself looking closely at the women. None of the people glanced at us as we passed. Can't they see us? I asked. We're of no interest to them, he said. They're absorbed by their own concerns. I saw some people sitting on boulders, and it gave me an odd sensation to realize that those boulders were created by their minds. They sat, heads bowed, hands hanging loosely, staring at the ground, immobile in their desolation. I know that unless they were deaf, they heard us walking by, but none gave any sign of noticing our presence. Again, I found myself looking at the women. Don't, I thought abruptly. She isn't here. But Albert didn't say that, came the sobering response. He said that he didn't know. Was it possible? I thought, looking closer still. We were so near to several of the people now that I could make out their features despite the gloom. The sight made me catch my breath. Get used to it, Albert said. You'll see worse. His tone seemed almost unsympathetic, and I glanced at him, wondering uneasily if the place was changing him. If he were unable to resist it, what hope was there for me? Shivering, I looked back at the people. Anne couldn't be here. She couldn't. The features of the men and women were exaggerated, like those of acromegalecs. Not so much the faces of people as bloated caricatures of them. In spite of my resolve, I looked intensely at the women. Was that Anne's malformed face? I fought it off. No, she wasn't there. She isn't here, is she? I pleaded moments later, not strong enough to retain conviction. No, he murmured, and I exhaled long and hard. We passed a young man lying on the ground, his clothing torn and stained by grime. I thought at first that he was looking at us, then realized from the cast of his eyes that his gaze was on his thoughts, a stare of withdrawn despondency. I swallowed as I looked at the lost expression, and the fetid air felt as though it were trickling down my throat like cold glue. Why do they look like this? I asked, pained by the sight. One's appearance retrogrades with one's mind, Albert answered. The same thing happens on Earth. People's faces altering over a period of time with their actions and thoughts. This is only a logical, if terrible, extension of that process. They all look so grim, I said. They are, he replied, grim in their preoccupation with themselves. Are they also bad? I asked. He hesitated before answering my question. Finally, he said, try to understand, Chris, when I tell you that this is nothing compared to what lies ahead. The people you see here may not be guilty of sins which were in any way horrendous. Even a minor transgression takes on darker aspects when one is surrounded by those who have committed similar transgressions. Each person multiplies and amplifies the failures of others. Misery loves company, is what they say on earth. It should be. Misery in company grows ever worse. There's no balance here, you see. Everything is negative, and this reverse animation feeds upon itself, creating more and more disorder. This is a level of extremes, and extremes of even a lesser nature can create a painful habitat. You see their auras? I hadn't noticed in the paucity of light, but as he called them to my attention, I did. All consisted of drab shades of brown and gray, dismal, muddy colors. These people are all the same, then, I said. Fundamentally, Albert replied, which is one of the curses of this realm. There can be no rapport between the people, because they're all alike in essence and can find no companionship, only mirror images of their own shortcomings. Abruptly, Albert turned to his right. I looked in that direction and saw the first, relatively rapid movement I've observed in this place, the lumbering hobble of a man behind a hut. Mark, Albert shouted. I looked at him in startlement. He knew the man? Albert sighed unhappily as the man remained out of sight. He always runs away from me now, he said. You know him? I've been working with him for a long, long time, he answered. There have been times when I thought I'd almost gotten through, convinced him that he wasn't a prisoner here, but had brought himself to such a plight. He shook his head. He won't believe it, though. Who is he? I asked. A businessman, he said. A man who in life concerned himself with nothing but the acquisition of wealth. He spent almost no time with his family or friends. Days and nights for 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, he thought only of monetary gain. And yet, he feels betrayed. He thinks he should be rewarded for what he did. I work damn hard, is his constant lament. No matter what I say, he tells me that. As though his total absorption in profit was its own justification. As though he had no responsibility to anyone or anything else. An occasional donation to some charitable cause convinced him of his generosity. Remember Marley with his chains? Albert asked. The simile is apt. Mark is encumbered with chains too. He just can't see them. I looked to my left and stopped in sudden alarm as I saw a woman who looked so much like Anne that I was sure it was her and started towards her. Albert held me back. It isn't Anne, he said. But I struggled in his grip. Don't let your anxiety to find her make you see her where she isn't, he cautioned. I looked at him in surprise, then started turning back towards the woman. She did look like Anne, I told myself. I stared at her. There was little actual resemblance. I blinked and looked more closely. I had never suffered from hallucinations in my life. Was it to start now? I kept staring at the woman. She was sitting huddled on the ground, covered from head to toe by a network of thin black threads. She didn't move, but stared ahead with lifeless eyes. I take that back. Like the young man, she was staring inwardly, gazing at the darkness of her mind. Can't she break those threads? I asked. With the least of effort, Albert answered. The thing is, she doesn't believe she can, and the mind is everything. I'm sure her life on Earth must have been one of great self-pitying frustration. Here, that feeling is exaggerated to the point you see. I thought she looked like Anne, I said, confused. Remember what that man said, Albert told me. Be alert at all times. I looked at the woman as we walked off. She didn't look at all like Anne. Still, she made me wonder. Was Anne in a similar plight? Imprisoned in some other place like this? The thought was harrowing. As we continued through the silent, formless village, past its mute and wretched population, I began to feel so tired that it brought back memories of weariness I'd felt just after death. Lacking the strength to do otherwise, I found myself beginning to hunch over as I walked, taking on the posture of some of the people nearby. Albert took hold of my arm and straightened me. Don't let yourself be drawn in, or we'll never reach Anne, he said. We're just starting out. I forced myself to walk erectly, concentrating on resistance to the weariness. It helped immediately. Be aware, Albert repeated what the man had told us. I'm sorry, I said. A wave of depression beset me. Albert was right. We were just starting out. If I was vulnerable already, how could I hope to reach? You're hunching over again, Albert warned. Dear God, I thought. It has happened so quickly, the slightest thought affecting me. I would resist it, though, I vowed. I wouldn't let myself succumb to the dark blandishments of this realm. A powerful place, I murmured. If you let it be, Albert replied. Speech, I thought. Silence was the enemy. Negative reflection. What are those threads around that woman, I asked. The mind is like a spinning wheel, Albert told me. In life, it constantly weaves a web which, on the day of our passing, surrounds us for better or worse. In that woman's case, the web became a snare of selfish concerns. She can't. I didn't hear the rest of what he said because my gaze was drawn to a group of people crouching and kneeling around something I couldn't see. Their backs to us, their hands rapidly conveying something to their mouths. All of them looked bloated. Hearing the sounds they made, grunting, snarling, rending noises, I asked what they were doing. Eating, Albert said. No, change that. Gluttonizing. But if they have no bodies, they can never be satisfied, of course, he said. They do it all from memory, only believing that they eat. They might as easily be drunkards swilling non-existent liquor. I diverted my eyes from the sight. Those people were like creatures gorging on a kill. I hate this place, I thought. Chris, walk erect, Albert said. I almost groaned. That instant of hatred had been strong enough to bend me forward. More and more, I was beginning to appreciate the import of that man's words. Be aware. To our left now, I could see a tall gray structure which resembled a rotting warehouse. Its massive doors were open, and seeing hundreds of people moving about inside, I started in that direction. Maybe Anne. I was forced to stop as vibrations from the structure hit me so hard that I gasped as though physically struck. I stared at the figures moving in the cavernous gloom, their clothes hanging loosely on their bodies, their features distended and pale. Each person walked with bowed head, taking no notice of anyone around, pushing others aside without a vestige of reaction if they happened to collide. I don't know how I knew it, but their thoughts were open to me, massed on one dark theme. We're here forever, and there's no hope for us. That isn't true, I said. For Anne's sake, I couldn't let myself believe that. It's true as long as they believe it, Albert said. I turned my head to shut away the sight. This must be hell, I thought, limitless and grim, a place of Chris. Oh God, I murmured, frightened. I was hunched again, my movements slowing, aging. Would I never be able to resist the baleful influences of this realm? Was there no hope at all that Chris! Albert stopped and forced me upward, holding my arms tightly. He gazed into my eyes, and I felt a flow of something coursing through my body, restoring energy. You've got to remain alert, he said. I'm sorry, I muttered. No, don't be sorry, be strong, I told myself. I tried to concentrate on resisting as we moved on through the nebulous light, leaving the dingy sprawl of huts behind. This place was not silent. As we neared it, sounds of anger and contention rose in volume. People quarreling, their voices strident, savagely vindictive. Soon I saw them. No one touched another person. Contact was entirely by words, vicious, cruel, assaulting words. A malicious haze hovered just above the people, an intermingling of their murky auras, ugly red flashes of fury darting between them. Albert had warned me that we approached an area where violent spirits crowded together. This section was the least of it, he told me as we walked. The violence here was at least confined to verbal abuse. Is this a place you've gone to before? I asked. I had to speak loudly to make myself heard. One of them, he answered. As we circuited the mob of clashing people, I began to feel their icy thrusts of venom at us. They didn't even know who we were, yet they hated us completely. Can they harm us? I asked uneasily. Not if we refuse to accept their wrath, Albert told me. They're far more likely to do harm to living people who aren't aware of their existence. Fortunately, their mass thought rarely focuses. If, on occasion, it does, stronger mentalities above become aware of it and dissipate the output, so it cannot hurt the innocent on Earth. Of course, there are individuals on Earth whose nature is receptive to those thoughts, who provide an access to them. These cannot be helped. That's the pitfall of free will. Any man or woman possesses the capacity to give entry to dark thoughts. The floor of hell. The more we walked now, the more repelled and nervous I became. A kind of aching restlessness filled me. I felt cramped and stifled, as though the atmosphere were closing in around my body. The air in my lungs tasted vile, unclean, as thick as mucilage. Adjust your system again, Albert said. Once again, I'd done it 5 times now, or had it been 6. I visualized myself as I would have to be to function under these new conditions. Not function in comfort, God knew. That concept had long since left my system. Survival was all that I could hope for now. Once more, I felt my body clotting. So much so now that I might well have been alive on Earth again. My flesh congealed and weighted, my bones coagulated into hardness. Adjust your mind as well, Albert told me. This will be the worst you've seen. I drew a deep breath, grimacing at the taste and odor of the fetid air. Is this really helping? I asked. If there were any other way to find her, rest assured we'd take it, Albert said. Are we any closer to her? Yes, he said. And no. I turned to him in irritation. What does that mean? I demanded. His urgent look reminded me to quell my anger. At first I couldn't. Then, realizing that I must, I strained to keep myself controlled. Are we any closer? I asked. We're moving in the right direction, he replied. I just haven't been able to locate her yet. He stopped and looked at me. I'm sorry that I can't explain it any better, he said. I can say that yes, it's helping. Please believe me. I nodded, returning his look. Tell me if you want to go back, he said. Go back? Let me look for her. I want to find her, Albert, now. Chris, you've got to. I turned away from him in fury and looked back as quickly. He was only warning me. My new impatience with him was a sign that the environment was affecting me again. I started to apologize and felt myself begin to tense with anger once again. I almost lashed out at him. Then a beam of reason pierced the dark resentment in my mind, and I knew once more that he was only trying to help. Who was I to argue with a man who had come to this awful place to help others? What in God's name was the matter with me? My sentiments reversed themselves again. I was disconsolate once more, stricken in my inability to. Chris, you're hunching again, Albert said. Concentrate on something positive. A burst of alarm. I willed my clouding mind to think of Summerland. Albert was my friend. He was taking me to find Anne. His only motivation, love. Better. Albert squeezed my arm. Hold to that, whatever it is. I'll try, I said. I'm sorry, I slipped again. It isn't easy to remember here, he said, and simple to forget. Even those words meant as explanation, like a shadowy magnetism, had a tendency to pull me down. Again, I thought of Summerland, then of Anne and my love for her. That was better. I would concentrate on Anne. The light was getting dimmer as we walked now. Even with my concentration on an area of light around me, the nimbus seemed to shrink as though some outside pressure forced it in. Albert's light was stronger, but even his illumination soon became no brighter than that of a dying candle flame. It seemed as though I felt a gathering thickness in the air. We might have been moving along the bottom of a deep and murky sea. There were no people anywhere in sight, no structures. All I saw ahead were rocks, a line of craggy boulders. Moments later, we had reached the crater edge. Leaning forward, I looked down into the blackness of it, then pulled back, sharply at a rush of something from below, something toxic and malignant. What? I muttered. If there's any place I've been to that deserves the name of hell, this is it, Albert told me. It was the first time I had ever heard the sound of misgiving in his voice, and it made my fear increase. The constant throughout all of this had been his strength. If this place frightened him. We must go down there, though, he said. I wasn't sure if he was telling me or steeling himself for the ordeal. I drew in laboring breath. Albert, she isn't down there, I said. I pleaded. I don't know, he answered. His expression was grave. I only know that we have to go there if we want to find her. Shuddering, I closed my eyes and tried to remember Summerland. To my dismay, I found myself unable to do it. I strained to conjure up some vision of the lake shore I had stood on, the exquisite scenery. The thought was gone. I opened my eyes and stared out at the vast dark crater. It was miles in circumference, with precipitous walls. All I could make out on its floor. It was like trying to pick out details in a night-shrouded valley, were huge masses of rock, as though some cataclysmic landslide had occurred in eons past. I thought I made out openings, but wasn't certain. Were there tunnels in the rock? I shuddered again, trying not to let myself imagine what sort of beings might exist in those tunnels. We have to go this way? I asked. I knew the answer in my mind, but heard my voice speak nonetheless. my tone one of faltering dread. Chris, let's go back, he said. Let me look on my own. No, I braced myself. I loved Anne and would help her. Nothing in the depths of hell would keep me from it. Albert looked at me and I returned his gaze. His appearance had changed. He was as I remembered him on Earth. Nothing of perfection could survive in this place, and his features bore the cast I recollected from my youth. He'd always looked a little pale, a little ill. He looked that way again, as I was sure I looked. I could only pray that underneath his pallor, the resolution of the man I'd met in Summerland was still intact. We were climbing down an angling, rocky fissure. It was far too dim to see clearly, but I could feel slime on the surface of the rocks, a jelly-like matter which exuded a smell of decay. Once in a while, some small thing crawled across my fingers, startling me. When I twitched my fingers, whatever they were darted swiftly into cracks. Teeth clenched, I forced myself to concentrate on Anne. I loved her and was here to help her. Nothing else was stronger than that. Nothing. As we descended gradually, the feeling of, how shall I describe it? Materiality began to crowd the air. It was as though we climbed down through some unseen, grumous fluid. Adjustments came by seconds now. We were part of the environment, our very flesh adapting to it automatically. The air, could it be called that, was totally repulsive, dense and sticky, foul of odor. I could feel it ooze around my body, crawling down into my lungs as we descended and descended. You've actually been here? I asked. I was gasping for breath. We might as well have been alive, I thought, so complete was the sense of bodily function. Again and again, Albert said. I couldn't do it. Someone has to help, he replied. They can't help themselves. They, I thought. A convulsive shudder racked my body. What did they look like, the denizens of this forbidding pit? I hoped I didn't have to find out. I prayed that Albert would, with a sudden burst of discovery, know exactly where Anne was and take me there, away from this hideous place. I couldn't stand much. No, I stopped myself. I mustn't think that way. I could stand anything. I had to, in order to reach Anne. The lower realm, not an adequate description for this region, not bad enough by half. No light, the blackness of unfathomable night, no vegetation, nothing but chilled stone, a foul, repugnant, never-ceasing odor, an atmosphere to make the strongest man feel sick and helpless. The blackness was enshrouding now. It took every bit of concentration I possessed to keep alive the weakest glimmer of illumination. I couldn't see my hands anymore. Spelunking must be like this, the thought occurred. The darkness pressed against my flesh as well as we descended down and down. Would we be safer not to carry light at all, I wondered, so as not to be caught sight of by... I gasped with the thought. Abysmal blackness covered me. Albert, I whispered. Conceive of light, he told me quickly. I clung to the cold rock wall and strained to do as he had said, my brain laboring to create an image of illumination. In thought, I struck a match that would not ignite. Again and again, I raked its head across the rocky surface, but the best I could imagine was the vision of a furtive, random spark in the distance. I tried to imagine a torch in my hand, a lantern, a flashlight, a candle. Nothing worked. The darkness tightened its grip and I began to panic. Abruptly, I felt Albert's hand clamp down across my shoulder. Light, he said. Relief washed over me as illumination came back like a pale corona around my head. I felt a glow of reassurance at the light, but even more, at Albert's still intact ability to restore in me the strength to bring it back. Keep it strong in your mind, he said. There is no darkness in the universe to match that of the lower realm. You do not want to be devoid of light here. I reached out with my right hand to squeeze his arm in gratitude. At the same moment, something cold and many-legged scurried across my left hand, and I almost jerked it from the wall, remembering only at the last instant to keep myself from doing so. I clutched back at the wall with my right hand and closed my eyes. After a few moments, I murmured, "Thank you." "All right," Albert said. As we continued down, I wonder what would have happened if I'd fallen. I couldn't die. Still, that was little comfort. In hell, death has to be the least of threats. The curdled air was getting colder now, clinging to my skin with a crawling dampness that felt alive. Conceive of warmth, I told myself. I struggled to envisage the air of Summerland, to feel its warmth on my skin. It helped a little. But the smell was getting worse now. What did it remind me of? At first, I couldn't recall. Climbing downward, ever downward. Would we ever reach the bottom? Then it came to me. A summer afternoon, Mary returning from a ride on Kit. Just before she'd wiped Kit's lathered coat, I smelled it. I pressed my teeth together until they ached. The odor of hell is the odor of a sweating horse, I thought. Was this the place that Dante had confronted in his awful visions? It came to me at that moment, slowly, far too slowly. Every thought was an effort now. That just as I was able to repress the dark and cold, I could, by logic, shut away the odor as well. How, I wondered. My brain turned over like a foundering ship. Think, I ordered myself, and managed to evoke a memory of the fresh aroma in Summerland. Not a perfect memory by any means, but enough to ease the smell, to make my downward climb more bearable. Thinking to tell him what I'd done, I looked around for Albert, and a sudden burst of terror struck me as I failed to see him. I spoke his name aloud. No answer. Albert? No answer. Albert! Here! His voice just reached me, and by peering hard, I presently was able to see the faint glow of his presence moving towards me. What happened? I asked. You lost attention, he told me, and looking down, I did the same. Breath shook inside me as I looked down. All I saw was total and immeasurable blackness. How could he see anything there? I caught my breath then, listening. From the dark pit, I could hear a collection of nearly inaudible sounds. Screams and cries of agony, mad, raucous laughter, howlings of derangement. I tried not to shudder, but I didn't have the strength. How could I go down to that? I closed my eyes and pleaded, God, please help me to survive. Whatever lay below me, on the floor of hell. Hells within hells. I wonder now if someone with a psychic birthright, someone who, in supra-consciousness, had traveled to this place, had named the English sanitarium Bedlam, a noisome pestilence. The phrase occurred as we reached the bottom of the crater. The air was rent by every horrible sound which man is capable of emitting. Screams and howlings, shouted curses, laughter of every demented variety, snarls and hisses, bestial growlings, unimaginable groans of agony, shrill utterances of pain, savage roars and lamentations, screeches, howls, wails, clamorings, and outcries, the jangled tumult of countless souls in throes of derangement. Albert leaned in close and shouted in my ear, Hold on to me. I needed no encouragement. Like a child terrorized by every known and unknown dread in his mind, I clung to his arm as we started across the crater base, threading our way among forms that sprawled in almost every spot, some moving fitfully, some with spasm jerks and hitches, some crawling virtually like snakes, some as motionless as corpses. All of them resembled the dead. What I could make out through the feeble light we carried with us cowed my soul. A cloud of vapor hung above the rock-strewn ground, threatening to suffocate us until once again, for what innumerable time, we adjusted our systems to survive it. Below the vapors were the figures, clothed in filthy rags, which showed great gaps of gray and purple flesh, glowing eyes and lifeless faces staring at us, and I heard the buzzing sound. People sat on boulders, heads together as though they were conspiring. People copulated on the ground and on the rocks, screaming and laughing. People struck at each other, choked each other, battered each other with rocks, tortured each other, all with shouts and snarls and curses. A mass of crawling, twisted, wrenching, jerking, lurching, clashing, convulsive creatures filled the crater's basin, and I heard this buzzing. Now, as sight adjusted to the smoky gloom, I saw bands of ape-like creatures roving close together, talking to each other in guttural voices, moving, I could only guess, in search of some prospective evil, some brutal violence they might commit. And the buzzing continued, an interminable drone from a source I couldn't spot. Now I saw that, interspersed throughout the area we crossed, were pools of dark and filthy-looking liquid. I hesitate to call it water. A loathsome stench beyond that which I had ever been exposed to rose from these pools, and I was horrified to see movement in them, as though unfortunates had slipped beneath the surface and were unable to rise. And the buzzing continued, growing louder and louder, a haze of constant sound above the cacophony of human and inhuman noises. A sudden burst of vicious thought struck violently at me. But I thought we couldn't pick up thoughts, the idea came. I felt crushed beneath the weight of the assailing visions and could only assume that such thoughts were so rabid in their focus that telepathy was not required to absorb their vibrations, that such thoughts were actually tangible to the senses, more a wave of physical shock than a conflux of immaterial ideas. Feeling that wave as it seared and sickened me, I looked around and saw a knot of people standing about 10 yards from us, illuminated by a lurid, dirty-looking orange glow. Some had sneering grins on their faces, other expressions of savage hatred. It was a wave of their thoughts. Suddenly I cried out, stunned, the sound of it unheard beneath the lunatic din. The buzzing I heard was that of flies, millions of them. Everyone was covered with shifting clumps of flies, faces moving with them. They were settled in the corner of eyes and crawling blackly in and out of mouths. A ghastly vision filled my mind. Kit with a barbed wire cut on her face. A solid pack of flies collected on it like a lump of living coal. Those on the bottom gorging on her blood, their bellies red and swollen with it. Even when I'd waved my hand at them, crying out in revulsion, those flies hadn't stirred. The sickened horror I'd felt at that moment was nothing compared to this. My fingers dug into Albert's arm and I closed my eyes, trying to escape the sight. That was worse. The instant my eyes were shut, a rush of other sights began to flash across my mind. White-faced ghouls devouring rotted flesh, grinning vampires wallowing in gouts of dark blood from the throats of screaming children, figures of garbage and excrement embracing in hideous union, men and women. I opened my eyes with a jerk. As ghastly as they were, the sights around us were preferable to the ones I'd been compelled to see with my eyes closed. Resist their thoughts, Albert shouted. Don't let them weaken you. I looked at him in wordless dread. Had he known? I tried to resist, how I tried, attempting to avoid the grisly thoughts and sounds those people constantly inflicted on me, the smells and tastes and feels of this place. Anne couldn't be here, I told myself. I wouldn't allow myself to believe it. Abruptly now, as though there were some connection with my thought of Anne, the most elaborate of despairs and anguishes began to flood my consciousness. I can only say that nothing in my life had come even remotely close, because the physical brain is incapable of dealing with multiple thoughts at one time, whereas the spirit mind can take on mass impressions. Even a mind as lowered as mine had become. These impressions were like sprays of acid burning at my mind. Utter hopelessness and dolor vied for the very existence of my consciousness. A melancholia so vast it yawned beneath me like a pit without a bottom. Anne isn't here. The thought became my only defense. Not among these. I started crying out in shock as a man came lurching up to us, wearing what appeared to be the remnants of a toga, now blackened shards hanging from his body. His limbs were so devoid of flesh as to be skeletal. The hands he stretched out towards us were like talons on a bird of prey, the fingernails like black claws. His face was scarcely recognizable as such, distorted and malformed. His glittering eyes were small and red, his open mouth repulsive, filled with teeth like yellowed fangs. Much of his face was decayed, gray bone showing through the rotted flesh. I cried out, horror-stricken, as he clutched my arm, his touch causing an intense nausea to build up inside me. There, he cried, pointing with one of his claw-like hands. Involuntarily, I looked where he was pointing and saw a man dragging a woman towards one of the darkly viscid pools. She was shrieking in mindless terror, the sound of it cutting through me like razor slashes. I cried out again as I recognized her. Anne! Chris, no! Albert warned. Too late. I had already let go of his arm, already eluded his desperate grab for me. I'm coming, I shouted, lunging towards Anne. All hell broke loose. I'd never truly known the meaning of that phrase till then. In the instance I broke free of Albert, his protection vanished, and a mass of figures rushed at me, howling with demonic glee. As they closed in rapidly, I knew with a bolt of horror that I'd been tricked by the man. Had he known that I was searching for my wife? Was his mind that cunning? Whatever it was, he'd only made me think that it was Anne. Already I knew it wasn't. The moment I'd pulled away from Albert, the woman's face had altered to the ghastly look of all the others. Jarring to a halt, I tried in vain to turn, twist around in a frenzied panic. No use. I'd barely begun to move when they were on me from every side, waves of shrieking figures clutching at me. I staggered and lost balance, tried to catch myself and started falling. Howls of savage mirth enveloped me. I cried out, horrified, as I went toppling to the rocky ground, their bodies crashing down on top of me, hands clawing at my face and body, tearing at my clothes, my flesh. Faces blurred across my sight, some charred, some fiery red, all disfigured by scars or burns or ulcerous sores. Some had no faces at all, but something made of hair and bone where features should have been. I screamed out Albert's name, then had the hideous sensation of a swarm of flies flooding into my open mouth, into my ears and eyes. They seemed aroused by my helplessness. I tried to spit them out. I slapped at my eyes and ears with maddened hands. Again, I tried to scream out Albert's name, The only sound I made now was a choking gurgle as the surge of flies began to clog my throat. I tried to wrench myself onto my stomach so I could vomit them up, but the clamoring, screaming people wouldn't let me. They were hauling me across the ground on my back, yanking at my arms and legs, kicking me and screeching with insane delight at my impotence. The light I'd carried was virtually gone now. All I saw were twisted forms and shadows hovering all around me. All I heard were cries of demented joy as they dragged me over the ground, shredding my clothes and ripping my skin on razor-sharp rocks. That and the buzzing of flies. Albert, I thought in pleaded anguish, help me please. Total blackness now. The deafening buzz of fly swarms in my ears. The sensation of their crawling by the hundreds in my mouth and throat across my staring eyeballs. Abruptly then, I felt myself being plunged into icy liquid, shoved beneath its surface. Instantly, it flooded down my throat and pressed against my face, an indescribable sensation, a combination of every vile taste and smell conceivable. I felt the claw-like hands forcing me down into the liquid, my horror increasing ever more. How was that possible? As below the surface, other hands began to clutch at me. I tried to scream, but only made a strangled, bubbling noise as hands kept pulling at me, passing me down from unseen grasp to unseen grasp, dragging me deeper and deeper into the noxious depths. Bodies started clinging to me now, skeletal with streamers of rotting flesh. My eyes were tightly closed, but I could see their faces nonetheless. The faces of the living dead regarding me with gleeful, burning eyes as I went down and down and down. Anne, I thought, my consciousness began to fade. I failed you. I sat up with a shocked cry. Albert had his hand on my shoulder. As I stared at him, at last I looked around. We were sitting on a barren plain, all gray, with sky the color of muddy slate. A cold wind moaned across its stark, unending flatness. Yet, I tell you that compared to where I'd been, that plain was paradise. How did you get me? I asked. That I was with him seemed beyond my comprehension. You were only in their grasp a few moments, he told me. A few moments? I knew I was gaping. But they knocked me down and dragged me to a pool and pushed me underneath its surface where... He shook his head, smiling grimly. You were in my sight the entire time, no more than several feet away. They touched you only with their minds. God, I shivered uncontrollably. That has to be hell. It has to be. One of them, he answered. One? I stared at him, appalled. Chris, he told me, there are hells within hells within hells. Where Anne now stayed. We walked across the wide gray plain, sandals scuffing at the hard soil. There's no one place called hell, Albert was telling me. What men have called hell is a vacuum in which undeveloped souls find themselves after death. A level of existence which they cannot rise above because they are unable to think abstractly, but can only dwell upon temporal matters.